Welcome back to the Michael Lofton Show and Reason and Theology on a Friday. We're talking about the Magisterium, the Catholic Magisterium, which is the teaching authority of the Church, and whether or not it can be partially suspended. This is a thesis that, in a qualified way, has been put forward by Dr. Ed Feser, the philosopher. And I want to continue to engage it. I recently did a written response article to Dr. Feser's thesis. It's called "Can the Magisterium Be Partially Suspended?" And I posted this on Where Peter Is, and I want people to go and take a look at it. Certainly share it on social media. And what I'll do in this video is go through the article, read it, and also offer some explanation and commentary as I go along. But I certainly encourage everybody to go to the link there in the show notes where I just posted it on Where Peter Is, and share it on your social media so other people can be aware of a response to this stuff. But before we take a look at it, I do want to remind you of our sponsor for this show, realestateforlife.org. If you're looking to buy a home or sell a home, or even an office, doesn't even have to be a home. It could be an office or other kind of property anywhere in the world, in fact. Definitely check out realestateforlife.org because you'll be supporting the pro-life movement in the process of doing so. They'll take a portion of their commission upon sale and donate it to a pro-life organization. So certainly check it out. There's also a phone number there on the screen, 1-877-LIFE US 1, info at realestateforlife.org, or realestateforlife.org is the website. So certainly go ahead and check them out if you want to support the pro-life movement and you're looking to buy or sell a home. All right, so let's talk about the article. I'm going to share my screen. It was just posted and I want to call people's attention to it. Okay, so again, the article is called "Can the Magisterium Be Partially Suspended?" This is a response to Dr. Ed Feser. He and I had some back and forth, and it seems that Feser is of the opinion that a written response is more important than perhaps a video response or something like that. So what I decided to do is I did originally a video response, but he certainly indicated that he tends to only read stuff, doesn't really watch stuff on YouTube. So, okay, here we go. Here's a written response for those who prefer that method of communication. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at it. St. Thomas Aquinas, quoting Aristotle, begins on being in essence with the adage, "A small error at the outset can lead to great errors in the final conclusions." These words apply to a recent article by philosophy professor Edward Feser in Catholic World Report on the suspended magisterium thesis. A suspension in the exercise of the teaching office of the church for a certain period of time in certain situations. So that's what a suspended magisterium thesis is that the teaching authority of the Catholic Church for a period of time and in certain situations and contexts is suspended. It's not being exercised. And there are various positions for this. Some are more general and broad, some are a little bit more specific and qualified. Feser has a more qualified view, which we'll talk about here in just a second. In his article, Feser makes a case in favor of a qualified version of this thesis in light of Archbishop Victor Fernandez's recent appointment as prefect of the Dicastery of the Doctrine of the Faith. Feser argues for the possibility, based on his reading of the letter to Fernandez by Pope Francis upon his appointment, that it is possible that the DDF will largely no longer be exercising its magisterial function, with Fernandez as prefect. The notion of a suspense of the church's magisterium, or teaching office, has been floated in recent years by traditionalists, including Father John Hunwick, an Eastern priest from the Ordinariate of Our Lady of Walsingham. In a 2022 blog post, Hunwick invokes St. John Henry Newman as the inspiration for his thesis. He wrote that a suspended magisterium was a notion that Newman used in the context of the Arian controversy, in which the great majority of the bishops, the teaching church, and including the successor of St. Peter, were either heretics or were cowed into silence or compromised by the heretics. Hunwick opines that in the 1960s, the magisterium was in suspense during the papacy of St. Paul VI, in the period between his setting up of a commission to consider the question of contraception and his very courageous subsequent reaffirmation of the church's magisterial teaching with the publication of Humanae Vitae. Now, Hunwick also suggests surely we are in another such period of suspense now. In his view, the suspense began with the opening of the discussion of the possibility that Catholics who are divorced and civilly remarried may receive the sacraments in certain individual cases. He believes that the result of the subsequent synods on the family and Amor Laetitia was that the suspense only grew wider. He asserts that the suspense will only end when a subsequent Roman pontiff or an ecumenical council reasserts with unmistakable clarity that the teaching authority of the magisterium, or possibly when the heir, having run its course, happily dies a natural death. In other words, Hunwick believes the magisterium effectively stopped functioning in early 2014 and continues to this day with no end in sight. For Father Hunwick, the practical implication of this is that he feels a tentative hesitation about taking seriously any teaching statement of an apparently less than orthodox member of the hierarchy. Now, what's curious about this is, when I hope I've maybe misunderstood Hunwick here, but I don't believe that's the case. But perhaps he could come out and maybe further clarify. But it really does seem like he holds to a pretty broad understanding of a suspended magisterium functioning today, especially in light of this last part right here, this last quote. Now, Dr. Feser rejects Father Hunwick's idea that there has been a total suspense of the magisterium from 2014 onward, but considers plausible Hunwick's argument that a suspense took place following the release of Amor Laetitia because Pope Francis has persistently refused to answer these dubia. For this reason, Feser claims the Pope can plausibly be said, at least to that extent, to have suspended the exercise of his magisterium. In his article, Dr. Feser claims that although it doesn't follow that the suspended magisterium thesis is correct as a general description of Pope Francis's pontificate up to now, a recent new development is an indication that could make the thesis more plausible as a characterization of the remainder of Francis's pontificate. That new development, of course, was the appointment of Archbishop Fernandez. Now, several days later, I offered my commentary about his article on YouTube in a show entitled Preparing for a Suspended Magisterium, in response to Dr. Ed Feser. In this video, I offered some criticism of Feser's qualified version of the suspended magisterium thesis, as it was both an overstatement of Newman's theory and based on a misreading of the letter from Pope Francis to Archbishop Fernandez. Moreover, within hours of posting my commentary, an interview of Archbishop Fernandez with the Pillar confirmed my reading of Francis's letter to Fernandez, which entirely undermined Feser's qualified thesis. Not long after my video, Dr. Feser took to his blog and wrote a verbose, over 5,100 word response to my video in what amounted to little more than a long-winded and pedantic strawman argument based on misrepresentations of my criticisms. Ironically, Dr. Feser entitled the response Lofton's YouTube Strawman. Although he claimed I was not worth engaging and was a waste of his time, he proceeded to produce a furious flurry of foul tweets over the next several days, and even allowed Catholic World Report to repost his article. Unfortunately, despite his efforts, Dr. Feser's response reveals a serious misunderstanding of my initial critique of his thesis, and therefore he failed to address many of my main points in light of his assertion that the written form is more conducive to intellectual discipline. I offer this response. So that's why I wrote this article. Specifically, he thinks the written form is more conducive to intellectual discipline. Okay, all right, that's fine. Well, here's the written response. Complete versus partial suspense of the magisterium. Let's get into that, because that's kind of getting into the nitty-gritty here. Aquinas' axiom on small errors at the outset became manifest early on in Dr. Feser's response to my video, because he spent a considerable amount of time responding to a claim I did not make. He labors to argue that he did not advocate for a complete suspense of the entire magisterium, but merely asserts the possibility of a partial suspense of the DDF's magisterium under Archbishop Fernandez. In reference to the appointment of Fernandez in light of Pope Francis's letter to him, Feser states, "If so, let us hope that this temporary suspense of the functions of the teaching church does not last 60 years as the previous one did." This is all well and good, but Feser repeatedly states that I give the impression to my audience that I believe Feser holds to the idea of a complete magisterium or suspense of the magisterium and not a potential impartial suspense. He notes in his response to my video, quote, "My CWR article essentially has two halves and Lofton badly distorts what I say in each one. In the first, I explain what some of Pope Francis's critics mean when they claim that the magisterium has been suspended during his pontificate. Up to this point, Lofton gives the impression that I am at least somewhat sympathetic to this thesis, but in fact, not only do I not endorse it, I explicitly reject and criticize it." Later, he writes, quote, "Anyway, the main topic of the first half of my article is the claim that the magisterium has up to now been suspended during Francis's pontificate. Again, I explicitly rejected this claim. Is it true he rejected this claim? And I explicitly acknowledge that, or I'm sorry, it is true that he rejected this claim. And I explicitly acknowledged that in my video. In fact, I gave the timestamp, the 21 minute, 44-second timestamp of my original video critique. So I already acknowledged that. I explicitly acknowledged that. So one wonders why, despite my own words, Feser spent so much time suggesting I had distorted his position and then knocking down that straw man. I will assume this was due to poor delivery on my part, and that Dr. Feser was not engaging in rash judgment as described in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, number 2478. Unfortunately, this type of thing recurs throughout Dr. Feser's response to my video. He repeatedly brings up things that I never doubted and argues against views that I never asserted, even when I explicitly said so in the video. Perhaps this behavior by Dr. Feser was also my fault and not due to any deficiencies on his part. Nonetheless, these small errors in the beginning of Feser's understanding of my criticism resulted in the entire blog post being directed at claims I never made, while my primary concerns remained unresolved. Now, another part deals with the, as he puts it, quote, "the main magisterial organ of the church." This is probably the heart of the dispute. Another apparent misunderstanding of my original criticism involved my critique of his claim that the DDF was hitherto the main magisterial organ of the church. That is a quote for him. Direct quote. He says, "hitherto the main magisterial organ of the church." That is how he described the DDF twice, not just once. It wasn't a slip of the pen. Twice. Pay attention to that because this is important. Rather than addressing my primary concern, Dr. Feser spent a considerable amount of time defending his use of the term magisterial organ to refer to the dicastery of the doctrine of the faith. Admittedly, in my video, I did quibble over his use of the term magisterial organ in relation to a Vatican dicastery. I concede that his description of the DDF as a magisterial organ is a legitimate use of the term, which has not been standardized by the church. There is precedent of such language, of such usage by theologians, including Ratzinger and Dulles. I'm still concerned that describing a dicastery as opposed to the Pope or the Pope together with a college of bishops or a council as an organ of the magisterium can lead the average person to think that a dicastery can promulgate magisterial teaching autonomously when, as Dr. Feser acknowledges, it is only an organ of the magisterium when the Pope approves of its teaching in common or specific form. In this confusion, Feser mistakenly writes that I accused him of a jaw-dropping error for using the term organ to describe the DDF. He asserts, but my remark is only an error, jaw-dropping or otherwise, if one understands organ in Lofton's idiosyncratic way. But my primary objection was not to his use of the word organ, but with his description of the DDF as the main magisterial organ of the church, which again is something he called it twice. So it's not a slip of the pen. Twice. Main magisterial organ. Main is the key word here. Main, M-A-I-N. We have to deal with that one. That's the focus. After 3 lengthy paragraphs defending his use of organ, he completely ignores my point that the DDF is not the main organ of the magisterium and simply asserts, when properly understood, then my remark that the DDF is the main magisterial organ of the church is perfectly innocuous. In my video, I demonstrated that the papal magisterium does not primarily teach vicariously through the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith. Instead, the papal magisterium usually teaches immediately. Teachings that are made vicariously through the dicasteries with papal approbation, either in common or specific form, are not as common. For this reason, I was and still am deeply puzzled by Feser's suggestion that the DDF is the main instrument by which the magisterium teaches. What leads him to believe that under Archbishop Fernandez, the church will largely no longer be exercising its magisterial function? Dr. Feser tries to mitigate his claim in his response to me as merely a partial refraining, but the words largely no longer seem to indicate more than a partial refraining. Granted, largely no longer does not mean a complete refraining, which Feser rejects, and I never said he didn't. Still, wouldn't it all be up to the Pope anyway? This is why I found much of his article odd. Dr. Feser gives little attention to the fact that the papal magisterium is normally exercised immediately rather than vicariously. He does not even attempt to explain why he believes that the DDF has been the main way in which the church has taught hitherto. Does he really believe that? Even if Dr. Feser's novel reading of the Pope's letter was correct and the DDF was to cease functioning as an organ of the magisterium in some partial way, I suppose, wouldn't the Pope still be able to promulgate teaching on his own with a college of bishops? Feser's claim about the main role played by the DDF seems to be central to his argument. It is difficult to find a plausible explanation in Feser's article of how a partial suspense of the magisterium will occur under Archbishop Fernandez, or once Archbishop Fernandez takes over as prefect of the dicastery. But he seems to suggest that if the DDF does not exercise its teaching function, the inevitable result will be that the Pope will no longer have any teaching authority either. He writes, and notice that followed out consistently. This means that the teaching of Pope Francis himself, let alone the deposit of faith, it is his job to safeguard, is not something the DDF is in the business of imposing. It too would simply amount to a further set of ideas to dialogue about. Let's read that again. I mean, that's a pretty big statement. And I'm still trying to understand it in light of how he seems to be asserting a very, very partial and qualified understanding of the suspended magisterium thesis for the DDF. Again, he writes, quote, and notice that followed out consistently. This means that the teaching of Pope Francis himself, let alone the deposit of faith, it is his job to safeguard, is not something the DDF is in the business of imposing. It too would simply amount to a further set of ideas to dialogue about, end quote. Is Dr. Feser trying to say that based on Pope Francis's letter to Archbishop Fernandez, the teaching of Pope Francis himself would simply amount to a further set of ideas to dialogue about? This is an extremely bizarre claim, as the Pope can always promulgate magisterial teaching without the involvement of the DDF. Feser's article would have benefited from an explanation of how this makes sense. And I'm certainly open to hear, more from him on how it makes sense. But it does still remain a little unclear. Instead, he decided to spend a considerable amount of time addressing my criticism of his use of the term organ to describe the DDF. Now let's talk about Feser on papal error. In my video, I claimed that there is a protection and assistance of the Holy Spirit to non-infallible teachings. This idea, of course, has been taught by the magisterium, such as in the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith's 1990 document, Donum Veritatis, which states divine assistance is also given to the successors of the apostles' teaching in communion with the successor of St. Peter, and in a particular way, the Roman pontiff as pastor of the whole church when exercising their ordinary magisterium, even should this not issue in an infallible definition. or in a definitive pronouncement, but in the proposal of some teaching which leads to a better understanding of revelation in matters of faith and morals and the moral directives derived from such teaching. That's paragraph 17. Notice that. A divine assistance for non-definitive teachings. That's explicit. It's explicitly not infallible or definitive pronouncements. It is authentic magisterium, but it is non-definitive in nature. And it speaks of a divine assistance there. And I've also pointed out elsewhere with Pius XII, he applies the words, "He who hears you hears me," from Jesus, to explicitly non-definitive teachings of a pope in a papal encyclical. So that's something worth considering. Okay. Feser seems surprised by my assertion, writing, "If what Lofton has in mind here is the claim which some have made that even non-infallible exercises of the papal magisterium are somehow protected from error, then I have in fact argued elsewhere that that thesis is incoherent and not taught by the Church." I found this to be an odd comment, both in light of Dona Veritatis and the fact that I've been very vocal about the possibility of papal errors in the Pope's non-definitive magisterial acts. In fact, my doctoral dissertation is specifically on magisterial reversals, which assumes the possibility of certain types of error. Dr. Feser links to his article, When Do Popes Teach Infallibly?, where Feser argues against Emmett O'Regan's 2017 essay in La Stampa on the indefectibility of the Church, portraying O'Regan as holding to the view that all papal teachings are infallible. Now, there is a note here. For the record, I've already done a response to Dr. Feser's recommended article in a video entitled Dr. Edward Feser on Papal Infallibility, a friendly response. In this video, I argue that Dr. Feser's position is not nuanced enough, which is ironic given that Feser claimed I'm lacking in nuance. I also recently reviewed that 2017 essay by O'Regan, and he'll be on the show pretty soon. Having spoken with Emmett about this article, he has assured me that he does not maintain this view and that Feser does not sufficiently understand his position. I'm starting to see a pattern here. In short, Feser seems to think that either one must say that the Pope is infallible only in instances of ex cathedra, or that he can never teach error at all. I argue that there's a more nuanced middle position here, which says that the Pope is only infallible when he teaches ex cathedra, and he can teach error in his non-definitive acts, but such errors would not rise to the level of the grade of heresy. Rather, they would be lower in the list of theological censors. Does that make sense? Where it's not an either or. It's not either the Pope's only infallible when it's ex cathedra, or he could teach, heresy. There's a middle position here that says, well, yes, he's only infallible when it's ex cathedra, but that doesn't mean he can teach heresy, but it does mean that he can teach error. It just won't be of the level of heresy. Feser obviously doesn't know much about me, and he admits that. That is certainly fair. I don't expect him to. However, if he found my video response important enough to merit 5,100 words, then maybe he should have considered taking a few minutes to research my position on a given matter before attempting to respond. Let's talk about Feser and papal criticism. Dr. Feser portrayed me as unwilling to recognize the ability to criticize the Pope. He states, if it was legitimate for the Nouvelle Theology writers, respectively, to criticize the shortcomings they claim to see in the magisterium of their day, then it cannot be denied that it can be legitimate, respectfully, to criticize the shortcomings some see in Pope Francis's magisterium. Once again, I found this odd, given that many times I've respectfully criticized Pope Francis under the provisions of Canon 212, paragraph 3, Dona Veritatis. Once again, Dr. Feser launches missiles on an empty hill while my army watches from nearby in bewilderment. Well, there's a final concern here. Unfortunately, Dr. Feser began his response to me with the accusation that I engaged in libel and defamatory insinuations against him. He was offended at one point in my video when I said that some hold to a suspended magisterium thesis to justify dissent from the magisterium, although I did not refer to Dr. Feser directly. I was not attempting to discern his intentions or motives. I explicitly stated I don't know what his intentions are personally, so I'm not going to try to judge his intentions. That's a direct quote. Feser recognized that I said this, but decided to read my mind anyway, which I found to be odd, since he accuses Dave Armstrong of doing that to him, and then talks about him on his blog as Mind Reader Dave. Now, I'm not saying Dave actually did this, but Feser was certainly offended by Dave Armstrong and called him Mind Reader Dave for doing this very thing, allegedly. And yet it's the very thing that Feser did to me. He wrote, despite my words, that my obvious insinuation was that this was also his agenda and that he was being cagey about it. Based on this false assumption, he accused me of a defamatory insinuation and titled that section of his article, Lofton's Libel. The word libel is a legal term, and those who are guilty of it may be subject to legal action. I took strong offense at this accusation in a series of Twitter messages, which were in fact just responding to Feser because he was repeating them on Twitter. But he refused to back down from the claim. In fact, he simply continued to pile on more accusations against me. And then, not being content with making the claim on his blog and on Twitter, Feser's article with its accusations against me was republished on Catholic World Report. This negative publicity had a significant impact on my reputation, and I was subject to many questions and attacks as a result, including from many of my followers. Eventually, Feser walked back his libel claim in an article where he tries to justify his accusations against me, but ultimately retracts the charges, stating that he will take me at my word, which I kind of wonder, well, why didn't you do that to begin with? That's all I was asking, is that you take me at my word, but oh well. He claims that he was accusing me of libel and defamation in the broader moral sense, as opposed to the actual definition of the terms and how his accusations were received. Catholic World Report then reproduced his blog post, although the accusatory post also remains. I'll point out that the retraction that Feser put up, that Catholic World Report posted, was not up for long and disappeared pretty quickly from Catholic World Report, although the initial article accusing me of libel still remains on Catholic World Report. I just found that to be immoral in many ways. If you're going to post that and then a person makes a retraction, then keep the retraction up. Don't post it for a few hours and then all of a sudden it disappears. Oh well. I accept Dr. Feser's retraction, although I wish he had taken me at my word from the beginning. The damage was done to my reputation, and the confusion he caused led many people to dismiss me without hearing my side of the story. Even more importantly, these false accusations served as distractions from the real issue at hand. Feser's problematic and badly reasoned article suggesting that a partial suspense of the magisterium is a realistic possibility. So, that is the article. I have a link to it again there in the show notes. It is on Where Peter Is. Again, it's called Can the Magisterium Be Partially Suspended? Just posted today. Definitely go to the link and share it on your social media for others who are maybe confused about the issue and kind of the back and forth between he and I. Hopefully this helps clarify some of that confusion. Well, anyways, I hope y'all enjoyed this. If so, certainly hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. Also check me out, patreon.com/reason and theology, if you want to support what I'm doing here. See you later. God bless.
Behold these shocking images. Pope Francis coughing and even sneezing. Top-notch theological research made by a philosopher on his personal blog shows that there can be a temporary and even partial suspense in the teaching authority of the Catholic Church. Now, when the Pope coughs or even sneezes, he isn't teaching in that very moment. So the next time you see the Pope sneeze, remember there's a partial suspense in the main organ of the magisterium of the Catholic Church, and this is a big deal. Are you tired and confused by people peddling all kinds of wild perspectives about the Catholic Magisterium, and you want a more balanced and informed perspective? If so, check out my course, Understanding the Catholic Magisterium, at maximusinstitute.com. God bless. Hey, thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button and the subscribe button. See you next time. God bless.